Let me start with a quote tonight. It's always a good idea to have a nice quote. Solidarity is the lifeblood of the European project. Through their participation in that project and their citizenship of the European Union, member states and their nationals have obligations as well as benefits, duties as well as rights. Sharing the European demos is not a matter of looking through the treaties and secondary legislation to see what one can claim. It also requires one to shoulder collective responsibilities and, yes, burdens to further the common good. Respecting the rules of the club and playing one's proper part in solidarity with fellow Europeans cannot be based on a penny-pinching cost-benefit analysis along the lines familiar, alas, from Brexiteer rhetoric, of what precisely does the EU cost me per week and what exactly do I personally get out of it. This is a betrayal of the founding fathers' vision for a peaceful and prosperous continent. It is the antithesis of being a loyal member state and being worthy, as an individual, of shared European citizenship. If the European project is to prosper and go forward, we must all do better than that." Unquote. So, those of you who have heard this quote for the first time, I think we clearly see that this is someone very passionate about European integration. This is someone who believes in the dividends of European integration. Perhaps that is someone who takes these matters very personally. Perhaps maybe because of the background of that person. Clearly a lawyer, right? But wait a minute. This is not as dry as the text that lawyers normally produce, that you read one sentence, you start yawning, says a lawyer. Perhaps an advocate general at the Court of Justice? More like it. Perhaps an academic? Well, my friends, these are 2 of 3 closing paragraphs of opinion of Advocate General Sharpston in 3 joint cases against 3 member states in a matter that was very, very sensitive, that is reallocation of refugees. And these 2 paragraphs, you'll get the 3rd one later, they reflect a particular view of the world, a very human view, not a very technocratic view indeed. And all of this will make much more sense in about 45 minutes. So let me introduce our guest tonight. I'm very proud to say that as of 30th December last year, we can call Eleanor Sharpston Dame Eleanor Sharpston. She has been put on the list of honors by the King Charles III. She studied economics, languages, and law at King's College, Cambridge. Then she spent 3 years in Oxford. She was called to the English bar in 1980 and was a barrister in private practice 1980 to 1987, and then back in practice 1990 to 2005. In 1999, she received silk, so she became King's Counsel, hence the words KC. Now, but all her professional life, all the roads have led to Luxembourg. So first, during her scholarship, she spent a little time in the chambers of the then Advocate General from the UK, Sir Gordon Slynn. Then 1987, 1990, she worked as his referendaire, a legal secretary. He was first, when she served in his cabinet, he was the Advocate General, and then he moved across to become a judge. And then 2 years later, he moved to the House of Lords, when they met again, which is something that I'll explain a little later. And then she herself served as the Advocate General, the 4th and the final, sadly, British Advocate General of the Court from 2006 to 2020. A very important period in history of European integration. A lot of legal changes happened at the time. But she was also an academic. So being a barrister did not stop her from teaching at various universities, starting with University College London, but primarily at King's College in Cambridge. And this is where, if it were for the lawyers, by lawyers, this is where the introduction would have ended. However, this lady is larger than life, and we have various descriptions in different languages. Greeks call such people polymaths. In Slavic languages, we have something more apt, bearing in mind that Eleanor is also a musician. In Polish, we call them człowiek orkiestra, human being in orchestra, and the same in Ukrainian, correct me if I'm wrong, людина orchestra. Spoiler alert, musician, keen rower, sailor, be careful, black belt in karate. I did see that live. But, as she confessed in one of the contributions to the academic debate, I'm not known for eating students, at least royal. Then squash competitions, skiing, and football referee qualifications. And yes, she loves riding her motorbike and a sports car. We are very, very lucky to have Eleanor with us tonight in her first formal appearance as Dame Sharpston. The way we're going to do it today, we will talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then, of course, we will open the floor to questions. We will just kindly ask you, there will be a mic on the tripod in the middle, to come over and ask questions from there, because we are recording.
I'm tempted to say, follow that. I mean, what an introduction. Okay, Adam, you'd better kick off with the questions.
Right. That's little Eleanor. Many know Eleanor as British. However, she comes from a very European family, in fact. Irish-Lithuanian. She was raised in Sao Paulo, to begin with, and then spent her adolescent years in Vienna, and then moved to the UK to take up her studies at Cambridge and Oxford. And when she discussed her family background and the way the family worked, she said, I quote, "I came from a family background which was unashamedly card-carrying intellectual. The standard way the family spent time was talking about things, discussing issues. We didn't just sit down with a TV dinner. We tended to start talking about something that was topical, a philosophical problem. We took sides, we raised questions." So I think it's a good idea to start our conversation by introducing your family, your parents. Where did the family exactly come from?
Well, it's certainly true that I'm trying to think, did we ever sit down and have a TV dinner? I don't think we did. All right, the two sides of the family, and both of them equally important in terms of their background, their effect on me, the traditions they came from. My mother was Irish. No matter that she spoke English with a very upper-class English accent, that is because she had gone to a school where they had given her that accent. But if you just scratched a little, she was as Irish as the day was long. She was immensely lively, questioning, mischievous. She could make a joke out of almost anything, and she would say it with a dead straight face. And you get to the end of the sentence and you think, what did you just say? I remember one trip when we were together in the US, and we went to a restaurant that was doing very fancy new style food with all these very pseudo words about what was on the menu. And my mother suddenly, looking at the menu, said, "Ah, yes, we could have a steak with a coulis of freshly ground earthworm." Yes, you heard me right. Earthworm, all right? But she said it, as though she was reading the menu. And so you would always have this double take. What did you just say? She was a lovely lady, my mother. And she was somebody who believed in me. She believed in both her children. And it never occurred to her that you might be worried about what you were doing now, because what would be important would be the next thing on the road. I can remember when I was agonizing about the entry examination for Cambridge. You know, oh my God, am I good enough? Will I get in? And I went to spend the weekend with her, and we went for a walk. And she said to me very casually, you know, darling, the important thing when you're at Cambridge, it is important to make sure you emerge with a first-class degree, because that will make it possible for you to really to choose what you want to do. And I'm thinking, I'm wondering if I'm going to get into this university. And here is my mother thinking about the first-class degree and, you know, what happens after that. That was my mother. My father, I love her, my father was the most upright English gentleman that an immigrant Jew could be. He came from a very orthodox Jewish family, so orthodox that when they went to Cambridge, when he went up to Cambridge as a scholar, his family made sure they sent him food parcels so he could keep kosher. And he and my mother met at a Cambridge University French Society meeting, during which they spoke only French to each other, because that was the rule of the meeting, you will speak French. So they spoke French, and my mother always joked that he continued the acquaintance because her French was rather good, she was studying modern languages, and he wanted to practice his French to make sure he didn't lose it while he was doing studies in mathematics and then economics. And my father would always say with a rather fat laugh, there were other reasons as well.
Now, I suppose the fact that you have so many interests and so many passions, that must have come from this home environment that they created for you in Sao Paulo, then in Vienna.
Well, the environment was one in which it never occurred to me that if there was something I was interested in, that I couldn't have a go at it. And they were always, you know, if I wanted to try something, even if it was something quite dangerous, you know, okay, have a go. And that carried through very much when I went to university. You know, if you, at the time, if you were a girl and you got into Cambridge, you know, your family's friends would say, you know, that's wonderful news, dear. Your parents must be very proud of you. And then they would start to give you good advice. This is what your parents' friends always do, yes? So they would give you good advice, and they would say, of course, it's very important that you study properly, you know, devote yourself to your work, but university is about more than just studying. Absolutely. So they said to me, you know, I mean, there's lots of other things going on in Cambridge. For example, there is music, or there is student politics, or there's journalism, or of course there's lots of sport. Now, by this stage I had already started to have a bit of a hearing problem, which is why I had to settle for my second career as lawyer rather than my first career as a musician. And you know, I must have misheard what they said, because they had said music or student politics or journalism or sport. And I heard and. So I tried most of what was on offer.
So that's when the law came into the equation.
Well, law came into the equation right at the end of the story. I mean, you know, I got into Cambridge on Latin and Greek. And then I read economics, for which I had very little actual background, but never mind. And then my second year, I did modern languages because I loved languages, so I did French and I did Spanish. And then I went back to economics in my third year, and I did my degree in economics. And then I stayed on for a fourth year. My friends were very unkind about that. They thought that my reason for that was only a sports reason, that I wanted to try to get into the university first crew. They were wrong. I was just making sure that I did some law at university. I did 1 year of law at university, which was in my fourth year, and I tried to fit into that 1 year what I would need in order to get the first part, the academic part, of my qualifications as a barrister. So it was a bit of sort of pressure cooker year, trying to get everything into 1 year. It didn't, of course, stop me rowing, and it didn't stop me doing student politics and, well, a few other things. In theory, I was working very hard that year. Very hard. Yeah.
Not sure we should be giving such ideas to our students now.
I don't think you should believe me for a moment on that, by the way.
No, but of course, when you read law and then you did the barrister's course, at least the British bar was very male British bar. It must have been horrendously difficult for a woman without also legal background, family of lawyers, to go into practice, and bonus, he wanted to do EU law, which even back then was not the flavour of the month in the United Kingdom.
I think it was mainly unknown. You could say that's been part of the problem, that it remained unknown, but that's a separate discussion for another occasion. That is, of course, all of that is true. I was lucky in as much as my Inn of Court, all barristers belong to one of 4 Inns of Court. They're kind of associations of barristers. And I was lucky that my Inn of Court was prepared to take a bet on me. So they gave me 2 scholarships. They gave me a scholarship, first of all, to do my bar qualification and do my pupillage. And then my Inn of Court, the only one of the 4 Inns of Court, my Inn of Court, had a European law scholarship. And I guess, well, I think I'll probably shock you if I tell you how the interview for that went. Because, first of all, I didn't really decide a long way in advance I would apply for this, so I didn't sit down and study in great detail. But I put in for it, and they shortlisted me. And so the night before the interview, I thought, maybe I'd better just look at something before the interview. So I got hold of a copy of the Treaty of Rome, and I went through like this and thought, they've got something about that. That's interesting. Oh, they've got something about competition, state aids, and then they've got in foreign relations. Really interesting, right? So literally, I took the treaty and I read through it once. Okay? Then I go to the scholarship interview. And then I had some really, really good luck. Because the group of men, of course all men, the group of men who were interviewing me had never met a woman who had rowed for the University of Oxford. Or indeed, who had been the president of Oxford University Women's Boat Club. And so they were, they'd seen this on my CV. They were fascinated. And so for the first 23 minutes of a 25-minute interview, they did not ask me about EU law. They asked me about running Oxford University Women's Boat Club, which was great, because, it was my specialist subject. I could tell them all about that. I could speak with immense authority and conviction. I could answer questions, I was a star on the specialist subject of how to run Oxford University Women's Boat Club. And then 2 minutes from the end of the interview, they sort of look at each other and they say, I suppose we'd better ask her something about the law.
Can't see why not.
And I'm thinking, oh dear, it was going so well until now. And I kind of brace myself. This is where it's all going to go pear-shaped. And I look inquiring, and the chairman of the panel leans forward, and he says, Miss Sharpston, is there a particular area of European economic community law that interests you? And why does it interest you? Now, I mean, please, that is such a gift. It is wrapped in gold paper with a bow, okay? It is such a gift as a question. If you cannot answer that question, you don't deserve a scholarship, right? And so I'm going to use that rather vulgar English word bullshit. I mean, I managed to produce a very convincing 2 minutes worth of bullshit about EEC law. And I explained, it's all of it's this interaction between law and economics and politics, right? And they smiled at me and they said, thank you, that's been most interesting, Miss Sharpston. And they gave me the scholarship.
And then, of course, you did the bar exams and become a barrister. Still, I want to go back to the point that I made earlier, that it was a very, very men's world. And I remember you mentioned that during advocacy training, one of the persons doing it said to you, well, if we need to have women in the bar, then...
Just as better to have one who sounds like a bloke. I mean, I have always had a low voice. I think actually probably if we were in musical terms, I think it's probably gone down by a fifth since I started practice. I mean, it was always a low alto. But over the years of pleading in court and then asking questions as an advocate general, I think it's grown an extra depth to it. I mean, by the way, I sing tenor. I mean, what about it? But of course, that was a totally politically incorrect remark. I mean, you can't imagine making that remark now. But actually, it sort of fitted for the times in which I went to the bar. And I remember a different anecdote. In my early years of practice, I was working from chambers in Brussels, and I went over to the US to talk to a big company there that was maybe merging with a German company. And I had gone over, I was the youngest person on the team. It was cheaper to send me to the US than to bring various people out of their jobs in the US to Brussels. So I went off to Toledo, Ohio. And one of the things I was doing was I was going around a factory visit because I needed to know how they made the product, which was heavy engineering. And of course, in those days, as a woman barrister, you wore a jacket and a blouse, and you, of course, wore a skirt and nylons and tights and, little, fine. I mean, you didn't wear trousers, right? I don't know about you, good folk, but if you think about being a woman going around a factory visit with lots of blokes working, I mean, you don't really want to climb ladders and bend over looking at machinery wearing a business suit with a skirt. I mean, you don't actually want that, okay? And so I had been in the first part of the meeting, I was obviously wearing my business suit and my skirt. And then just before we went round the factory, I excused myself for a moment to go to the bathroom. And I got my trousers out of my bag, and I swapped the trousers, put those on, took the skirt off. And I reappeared wearing, what I'd been wearing before, except that I was now wearing trousers. I wasn't wearing scruffy jeans, by the way. I mean, they were perfectly respectable trousers. But they were trousers. And there was utter silence. And I thought, oh my God, this may be a little difficult to handle. And I was just working out how I said, if you think I'm going to go up ladders with lots of men looking at my skirt, you're wrong about that. And then one man, very, very nice man, kind of got the message. And he turned to the others and he said, Gal's right, you know. It will be better going round if she's not wearing a skirt. But I mean, this is, you know, I'm not talking about the early Neolithic period, right? I am talking about when I was a young lawyer, and although I'm a rather older lawyer now, it's not that long ago.
You mentioned that you practiced in Brussels, and then you moved to Luxembourg for the second time, but for much longer, for 3 years, when you joined the chambers of Sir Gordon Slynn, the British Advocate General. Now, of course, there's a huge difference between advocates general and judges at the court, and Gordon was first the AG, and then he became a judge. And I remember you explained it quite well to me, the difference between Gordon being the AG and Gordon being the judge.
Well, it was a very clear difference because, I mean, Gordon was an exceptional lawyer. He was very quick. He was very fierce in his own way, but he's very sharp, and he was just there. You know, he was on the subject. But he had come to the court having already been a judge in the United Kingdom. He had been the chairman of the Employment Appeal Tribunal, so he was already an appellate judge. He was Sir Gordon Slynn, and he was used to a legal system in which any judge is free to express his own opinion. Not a collective decision, you can write what you want. And Gordon really liked being an advocate general. I mean, it suited him very well indeed. And working for Gordon as an advocate general was a bit like going hunting in the jungle with your panther, all right? I mean, you were respectful of the panther. You stayed behind the jaws, but you followed the panther as it went through the jungle, and you watched respectfully as it got its prey and killed it, and then licked the blood off its paws. It was very impressive going hunting with Gordon as an advocate general. And then he decided to move across and be the judge. You may wonder why on earth did he do that. There was a very good reason. He wanted, when he moved back to the UK, he wanted to be appreciated in the UK and to go to the Supreme Court, to the House of Lords. And he knew that within the British establishment, nobody who mattered had any idea what an advocate general was. But they knew what a judge was. So he made the calculation, which I am sure was correct. He made the calculation that he should move across from being the advocate general to being the judge. And then, having been the judge for a couple of years or so, he would go back to the UK and go into the Supreme Court, into the House of Lords. The problem about this, it was a very sensible career move. The problem was that Gordon hated being a judge in a collegiate system where there was just a single text which you had to agree on. There had to be a consensus. If you didn't agree with the majority, you just had to shut up and sign it nevertheless. And working for Gordon, as I did for 2 years, when he was a judge, if I may continue the analogy of the panther, it was like being in London Zoo, locked up in the cage with a very unhappy panther. Not a good idea at all. The panther would walk up and down inside the cage, and the tail would be doing this. And at a certain moment, when the panther was just too fed up for words, he would turn round and he would, he would claw at you because you were the nearest thing. And, you kind of mop the blood off. And you'd think it's not really his fault. I mean, ow, that hurt. But it's not his fault. He doesn't like being a panther in a cage. This panther should be allowed to be in the jungle where he's a very good panther. You shouldn't have put him in a cage at London Zoo.
Gordon also had a wonderful sense of humor. I remember meeting him for the first time in Warsaw. I think that was 2 days before my PhD viva. I was 26, so I was paralyzed, just scared like hell. And we were sitting together at the dinner. I introduced myself and Gordon looked at me and said, "Adam, have you read Harry Potter?" It was the first thing he said to me. And I looked at him, "No, my lord, I actually haven't had the time to do it." "You should read it. We all read it in House of Lords." And I pictured them sitting, with their gowns and wigs and just flicking through Harry Potter under the table. So that was 3 years. You were in Luxembourg with Gordon, and then you decided to move back to the UK. Was there a point where you thought, I wish I could go back at some point to the court, perhaps in a different capacity?
Oh, that point was literally as I was leaving the court after my 3 years as a referendaire. I had loaded my unfortunate 250cc motorbike with I'm sure it would not have passed the police inspection because I had so many things tied onto it. And I remember stopping the bike as I was leaving the court and turning around and looking back at the court and thinking, it would be so amazing if I ever got the chance of coming back here as an Advocate General. Oh, don't be stupid, come on. That's about as likely as a snowball's chance in hell. I mean, come on now. Get on with the rest of your life. Right now, you've got to get yourself... I was driving overnight in order to be teaching at 9 a.m. the following morning. So, that was rather more immediately important than dreams of being an Advocate General maybe at some undefined point in the future. But I had a wonderful 3 years as a referendaire, really, really interesting 3 years, and made lots of very good friends from different systems, different cultures, and I loved being at the court.
But then you returned to the UK and you started a double career. So on the one hand, there was the bar, and on the other hand, there was the academic career.
Adam, dear, it was very simple. I knew I had to restart my career as a barrister literally from zero because I'd been away for 3 years, right? And I needed to be able to pay the rent on somewhere to live, and I needed to eat, right? So I needed to have money that was coming in from my academic work, simultaneously with trying to persuade people in a new set of chambers where finally I had been given a tenancy, that they would like to use this woman they'd never heard of,
Who does EU law?
Who did EU law, absolutely. And I since I'm fond of eating and sleeping warm, it was pretty obvious, that I needed to run two careers.
But still, if we look at your career at the bar, there were two strands. One, you were pleading on behalf of the UK at the court, in many cases, the Court of Justice.
Black hat.
But then again, you also did a lot of pro bono work, which goes back to the quote we started from, it's a particular mindset. And you did a number of pro bono cases, but the one that I would like to ask you about is this SS Stora case.
Yes, well, that was it was actually my last case at the bar before I went to the court as an Advocate General. And I could almost describe it, I don't know, is it a Don Quixote case? Is it a case, an impossibly idealistic case? The SS Stora was a Danish merchantman, a merchant's ship, which had been torpedoed and sunk in the middle of World War II. She had been sailing in a convoy in the Channel. On board, she had had a number of sailors from the Royal Navy who had been posted on board her. She had guns and ammunition, which was supplied by the Royal Navy. Her captain was sailing under naval discipline. She was in the convoy, so she was obviously following naval signals. She had a cargo which consisted of parts of tanks and parts of aircraft. And there was a first attack by some German E-boats, and she fired her guns and helped to drive them away. And then they came back for a second attack, and obviously they had worked out she was dangerous because she was armed. And they torpedoed her, and she sank. And 21 members of the crew died. The wreck of the Storer is just off the coast near Hastings. It's in about 40 meters of water. It's to the north of the shipping lanes. If it were under the shipping lanes, it would be protected because with all the ships going overhead, nobody would dive because they'd be killed when they came up. But the Storer is to the north of the shipping lanes, and she's at a depth that you can dive, and the wreck is very complete. It's very attractive to a driver to go and explore the wreck. And people were diving on the wreck, but they were also taking souvenirs. This greatly upset the two daughters of Petty Officer James Varndell, Royal Navy, who was one of the Navy personnel on board who had lost his life. Some very good historians at Hastings Maritime Museum spent about 5 years putting together the story of this ship. The background, all the detail about her, the cargo, everything. The interview with survivors, the whole dossier, everything. And then they wrote to the Minister of Defence, and they asked the minister to consider designating the Storer as a war grave. Now, when I say designate, you must understand this would have cost the minister nothing. Designating means that you write a statutory instrument saying this site is protected. You may dive on it, but you may not touch anything. It did not involve having a Royal Navy ship circling overhead, to protect the site. It would have cost nothing. But the minister said, I am not required to consider designating the Storer because she doesn't qualify under the Protection of Military Remains Act, because she was not being used for the purposes of or in service with the armed forces of the Crown. Please note, by the way, that the E-boat that torpedoed the Storer, if she had sunk, she would have qualified. But the minister said the Storer, I don't even need to look at the Storer. She doesn't qualify. And so we applied for judicial review of that decision. And I felt very proud and very humble when I stood up to do that case, because I stood up as a barrister to do the case, and behind me there were 2 rows of very carefully dressed elderly gentlemen, all wearing blue blazers, very, very, very correct, sitting there in court. They had come to hear their case. They were all survivors, merchant seamen, who had served in the Royal, not in the Royal Navy, but the Merchant Navy, the 4th arm. They'd been merchant seamen in World War II. The Merchant Navy had had worse losses than any of the 3 armed services. And there they were in court listening to their case. It was totally symbolic. I mean, you know, we were not going to ask for every merchant ship that had ever been torpedoed to be designated. But one ship, come on, one ship you can designate. At the end of the first day, the judge goes out, and I turned round and I said, gentlemen, I hope you tell me, what do you think? And they said, well, it's clear that the counsel, the lawyer acting for the Ministry of Defence, has no idea what it was actually like. And then one of them said, I was serving on merchant ships. I was in the drink, as in I was in the water, 3 times before my 18th birthday. But I was lucky, I got picked up. I took that nice gentleman back to my chambers with my instructing solicitor. We gave him tea, we gave him our best biscuits, and we took a statement from him explaining what it was really like sailing in the Merchant Navy, supporting the Royal Navy during World War II. And then the following day, I did what you can only do as a KC, as a QC. You're allowed to be a bit cheeky. You can do things that you could never get away with as a junior barrister, all right? So I stood up and I said, my lord, I have a very unusual application to make. And I freely admit it is extremely unusual. The judge looks at me. And I said, my lord, your lordship will have seen behind me in court, yes, Miss Sharpston, I saw your fan club. I said, my lord, you will probably, your lordship will have worked out that the gentlemen who were sitting there, and some are still there today, have a reason for being there because they are former merchant seamen. I have been able to take affidavit evidence from one of them. This is evidence I did not know existed until yesterday evening after court. So there is no way I could have got the evidence before. It is first-hand evidence from somebody who lived through those times. And it may assist your lordship in your lordship's consideration of the case simply to have that kind of background evidence. So I should like, I know this is unusual, I should like permission to introduce that evidence. Obviously, I had made my opponent aware that I was going to do this. My opponent jumps up and he's, you know, I mean, does my learned friend have no respect at all for the rules of court? You know, I mean, this is completely outrageous. And the judge looked at me and the judge looked at my opponent. I mean, my opponent said what I would have said in his place. And he said, well, Miss Sharpston, as you rightly say, it is a very unusual application. But this is a very unusual case. And I don't know if the statement will assist me, but I am minded to admit it in evidence. And I went, oh, God, we got the wrong judge, says my opponent to himself. We won that case. I went to Luxembourg to start as Advocate General. The Ministry of Defence appealed to the Court of Appeal. My very nice co-head of chambers in London said, if necessary, I will do it for free in the Court of Appeal. It would be nice to be paid. We actually managed to get him paid because the judge made an order that they could only go to the Court of Appeal if they covered both sides' costs, which is in itself very unusual. And Michael Paul's QC did it in front of the Court of Appeal. Meanwhile, I am sitting in Luxembourg, you know, in my nice new robes, agonizing what is happening to my case. Please, please, what is happening to my case? Well, what was happening to my case was that the chairman of the Court of Appeal, the Master of the Rolls, was sitting, and he said to the Ministry of Defence, so, Mr. Tier, if I understand your argument, you are saying that this ship, with this crew and this cargo, if it is sailing from Dover to Cardiff docks, it's not covered. But if it is sailing from Cardiff docks to Alexandria to supply the army there when it gets torpedoed, it would be covered. Is that your case? And my unfortunate opponent, Nigel Tier, said, yes, my lord, that is my case, those are my instructions. And the Master of the Rolls put his pen down. Friends, it is never a good sign if the judge puts the pen down, okay? You want the judge making a note of what you've just said. So if he puts the pen down, this is not looking good. The storer is now designated.
Bless. So at that time, you moved to Luxembourg, back to the Court of Justice. Now, that was after Sir Francis Jacobs, the previous Advocate General, who announced his retirement. And if I remember correctly, you applied last minute, didn't you?
I very nearly didn't apply at all. I thought I was too young. I thought I wasn't well enough known in the UK. I was known in the court because I had done quite a lot of cases before the court, but I had not done that many cases in front of the UK courts. And I was a woman, and I was left-wing, and, many, many things. So I very nearly didn't apply. And then literally the day before the deadline, two nice women friends of mine got hold of me, and they said, if you don't apply and they give it to some muppet, you will be so pissed off with yourself. So you better apply. And I thought about this pungent advice, and I thought, I think they have a point. So, of course, when you're making an application, you don't just there's the application. The first thing is you need an up-to-date curriculum vitae. I hadn't been planning to apply for anything, so I got hold of an old one, and, I kind of made it and brought it up to date and stuff. And by now it's 11 o'clock at night. And then you need to write what in French we would call the lettre de motivation. So the letter which says, I am the best thing since sliced bread. And really, you want to think of me as the person for this job. So I wrote the letter, and by now it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I am in London. I'm meant to be in Cambridge at 9 o'clock to teach for 2 hours. Now, when I started as a barrister, we've mentioned the motorbike. When I started as a barrister, I spent a certain amount of time working as a motorcycle courier, because it's a very dangerous way of getting cash. And so I knew about how you deliver things to government buildings at strange times of the night. I equipped myself as I should be equipped as a motorcycle courier. So I had a bag with papers in it. I had a clipboard with various jobs, obviously entirely invented jobs, right? Signed off already. And then there was this job, and then there were some more jobs. And I hopped on my motorbike, and I drove to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, because I knew that all these big government buildings, they always have a night watchman, all right? There's always someone there whose job it is to be, to sort of make sure the building doesn't get up and walk away, I suppose. Usually, at this time of the night, they are asleep.
As one would.
As one would be. But if you go to the door and you put your thumb on the bell and you leave it there, sooner or later they will come to the door because they want that horrible noise to stop. So that's just what I did. And eventually the door opens and the night watchman comes out and he swears at me, which is fair enough. And I say, mate, I'm awfully sorry. You know what it's like, these bloody customers. Honestly, they've always got something they need doing in a hellfire hurry. I was told I had to bring this round today, as in tonight. It has to be here for tomorrow morning. I'm really sorry to have woken you up, mate. here's the envelope, you see, right? And if you could just sign for it on my clipboard, please, so that my gaffer's got proof that I've made the delivery. And I hope you get back to sleep, I'm really sorry, And I drive off with proof that this has been delivered. And I go home, I have about 2 hours sleep, then I get on the motorbike again, and I drive from London up to Cambridge, and I give my 2 hours worth of lectures, and then I phone the Foreign Office. Of course, at this moment, I am not the motorcycle courier. I am Eleanor Sharpston QC, with the accent to match. And I say, yes, good morning, yes. I wonder, could you help me? I have put in an application for the post advertised at the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and I had to arrange for this to be brought round outside hours. The courier company tells me it was delivered during the course of the night. Could I just check with you that you've received it safely? Yes, of course, I'll hold this, of course, yes. Yes, you have got it. Thank you so much, yes, thank you. Goodbye. So I got the application in, and in due course they made a long short list, and then they made a short list. And they interviewed 6 of us. I was obviously the only woman. I mean, it's hardly worth saying that. I was also the last person they interviewed. And we should note that, in theory, we all knew that who was meant to get the job. I mean, there was a competition, but there was a clear favourite, who was not myself. And they did the interviews, and they had announced a date at which they would make the results known. And the date came and went, and there was nothing. There was absolute silence. And it was a very, very strange period, because the 6 shortlisted candidates, we were not meant to know who the others were, but of course we did know, right? We kept on falling over each other. You went into court, you saw 2 of them coming out. You went to a conference, you met the other 3, right? And so we come up to each other and we say, have you heard anything?
Not a sausage.
Right, no, nor have I. Very strange, I've no.
It's strange indeed, yes, indeed.
I can't imagine. And then you walk away and think, is he lying to me?
Is she lying to me?
This went on for nearly a month. And finally, I got a phone call. I wasn't in London, I was out in the country. I was in jeans and a t-shirt, and I was all over Greece because I was busy mending a piece of farm equipment. Okay? And the phone goes. So I mop some of the grease off my hand, I take the phone call. I then have trouble persuading the person on the other end of the phone that I am indeed Eleanor Sharpston QC. I mean, as you hear, I have a low voice, and the person on the other end of the phone kept on saying, no, thank you, sir, but I must speak directly with Eleanor Sharpston QC. I said, you are speaking with Eleanor Sharpston QC. How may I help you? Well, I nearly rang off, I tell you. We sort of got past that. And then, I don't know if any of you have heard of the series, the Yes Minister series, making fun of British civil servants. Well, there is a character there called Sir Humphrey, who is, kind of the quintessential British civil servant. This lady was the female incarnation of Sir Humphrey. And she said, I have been directed to inform you. This is not ordinary English. I have been directed to inform you that the Lord Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary have indicated that subject to, and then there was a whole list of other stuff, right? They are minded to recommend to the Prime Minister that you be considered favourably. I mean, somewhere at the end of this sentence are the words Advocate General, Court of Justice, Luxembourg. By now, I'm really not breathing. But we got to the end of the sentence, and I thanked her. And I put the phone down, and I walked out into my Welsh Valley, and I burst into tears. And I said, I'm going home. I'm going home to the court. Dear God, I'm going home to the court.
And this is how the Times newspaper announced the appointment. This is the actual cover of the legal part of the Times newspaper. And you served at the court for 14 and a half years, delivering more than 400 opinions. Lots of opinions.
The most opinionated woman in Europe.
And you either would have heard about some of those cases already, or if you're taking Catherine Barnard's course, you will definitely hear about them. Cases like Zambrano on EU citizenship, the monster opinion on the free trade agreement with Singapore.
It destroyed 6 months of my team's and my life, that case.
You also did a rule of law case called Heinrich. But the one I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about is the case called Sturgeon, where the court actually did not follow you.
Well, I made a capital mistake. I mean, you can make mistakes as an Advocate General as well. I made a mistake because I pointed out to the court, the Sturgeon is the first of the cases about compensation for air passengers if the flight is delayed rather than being cancelled.
Can I just stop you, Leo, for a second? What do you get when your flight is delayed? Do you get compensation? If it's more than 3 hours. Now, if you read the regulation, it doesn't say so. Not at all.
The regulation had compensation if the flight was cancelled or if you were denied boarding, right? But the regulation didn't have a provision in it giving a right to compensation after X hours of delay. And I wrote a careful opinion with a very lovely referendaire who is now, by the way, a judge at the General Court, a brilliant guy called Geert de Bar. Lovely, lovely guy. We wrote a lot of stuff together. And Geert and I looked at the text and we said, oh, yeah, it doesn't say if there is a delay, you get compensation. And we explored this and we said, well, I mean, actually, there's something very weird going on here because you can have a situation where you are more inconvenienced by a delay than you are by the flight being cancelled. If the flight is cancelled and they put you straight onto another flight, I mean, okay, you're a bit late, but it's not really a problem. Whereas if your flight is delayed by 14 hours, they've really messed up your schedule for you, right? And so we wrote a very careful opinion, and we said in there that the legislator can pick a number, because all numbers are arbitrary, you know. Is it going to be 4 hours? Is it going to be 3.5 hours? 2 hours? 6 hours? What's the number? The legislator can pick a number which is by definition going to be arbitrary and then defend the choice. But fatal mistake, the next sentence said the court cannot. And we suggested that the court should reopen the oral procedure and it should talk to the council who'd written the legislation and put these problems to the council, to the legislator. Look, you seem to have created a situation which discriminates improperly between people who should be treated in the same way. So it wasn't that I thought you shouldn't get any compensation, but I thought you had to reopen the discussion. And of course, if you had reopened the discussion, there would have been time for the legislator to go and fix it, right? Because you could see there was a problem. And the court took my words, "the court cannot," as a challenge. And they said, "Oh, really? You watch us." and they literally created the compensation after 3 hours. They pulled it out of thin air. And, I mean, it was very popular, obviously, you know. How nice to get compensation. It's not in the text.
So next year, please make sure that you send Christmas cards to the court, thanking them for the money that you've just received from an airline. Now, I'm quite on purpose not going to ask you more questions about the court, because of course we have the lecture tomorrow. You will focus more about the time at the court, being the Advocate General for more than 14 years. With the 5 minutes left for this part of the meeting, I would like to focus on one thing, just show you one more photo. Eleanor also is a musician. She plays not in one orchestra, that'll be boring, in 2 Luxembourg orchestras on the viola. That was taken last year, wasn't it, after your concert in Luxembourg?
That was after the Orchestre de la Place de l'Europe's summer concert to a sold-out Philharmonie concert hall.
But you're also a keen rower. And because of rowing, you got into so much trouble that they almost kicked you out from the bar course.
Well, yes, I nearly didn't have this fabulous career. I nearly didn't have it at all, because I was trying to do too many things at once. I wonder whom that might be like, by the way. I'll leave you to judge that. I was specifically, I didn't, of course, have any, I don't come from a legal family. I didn't have money to spend a year in London doing the bar course. I did have a research grant in Oxford. And so I had this terribly bright idea that I would double it up. So I would do my work in Oxford, but simultaneously I would do the course in London. And originally I didn't think I would also be rowing for the university. However, the previous year I had been in the boat race, I'd been president of the club, and we had lost to Cambridge, but much less badly than we had the year before that. And the club looked at me and they said, "Well, you're not going to leave things half undone and half done. I mean, surely not. We need you to be president for the next year as well and finish the job." So for 6 months, Oxford did not know I was in London. London did not know I was in Oxford. And neither Oxford nor London knew that actually I was on the river about 6 miles away from Oxford at a place called Radley. This involved quite a lot of careful timing. It was like one of those, it was a bit like a Fado farce, you know, one of those plays where people rush in and out and hide behind cupboards or under beds, and, you know, it's split second. If you're under the bed in time, then the husband doesn't see that you've been seducing his wife. It was one of those. And for 6 months, I managed this trick. It involved a lot of changes of clothes on trains and wet rowing kit being stuffed into bags, but it worked, it worked. And then there was the boat race, and Oxford won. And the day after the boat race, for some reason, there was no world news. I mean, there were days like that, okay? You know, there hadn't been a plane crash. There hadn't been a presidential election. And the Times, which at that primitive state of the legal history, the Times was the newspaper that every lawyer bought every morning religiously because it had the Times law reports in it. This is all pre-internet, okay, guys? The Times did not have a photograph to put on the front page. And so they put a photograph of the winning Oxford women's boat race crew, with your humble servant grinning all the way from one ear to the other ear. And what was worse is I was absolutely in the centre of the picture, all right? It's not as though I was in the far back corner of the picture. You know, you can only see that much of my head, so that I'd say, well, I know it looks a bit like me, but it's not me. I'm literally, you know, sitting there in front of you like this, and yes, we've won, right? Well, the dean, the rector, as it were, the dean of the Inns of Court School of Law was really not very amused. And I was summoned in. I swear to you that if the dean had had the evidence which he knew must exist, that I had cut classes and so on, he would have thrown me straight off the course. But he didn't have the dirt. He didn't have the evidence. Okay? Because all the small groups where there had been a register, or my presence would have been missed, I had managed to turn up. And in the lectures, some friends of mine had put a tick if necessary. Okay, so he couldn't prove that I hadn't been there.
Don't get any ideas, please.
He couldn't prove I hadn't been there. And after 20 minutes odd, a very uncomfortable 20 minutes, you know, he threw me out of his office, but he didn't throw me off the course. And as he threw me out of the office, he said, I can tell Sharpston that you will never make anything of a career at the bar because you lack the necessary motivation, application, self-discipline. You're never going to make it as a barrister. And I remember getting out of there, you know, and checking that my head was still on my shoulders, and then thinking, you silly man. I mean, what do you think I've been doing for the last 6 months? Come on. You know, maybe I was applying these qualities to what you would consider to be the wrong target, but how do you think it was possible to do these 3 things simultaneously without application, motivation, and self-discipline? Come on!
And rowing has stayed with you since. I mean, on this photograph, you have the rowing team.
With the Advocate General.
With the Advocate General. And what happened was that Eleanor arrived to witness a boat being named after her. And there was an 8 crew, and one of the girls had a bicycle accident. So they were missing 1 rower. And this is how it ended. So, of course, Eleanor was rowing as the 8th, slightly older member of the team.
I think I was literally twice the age of the next oldest person in the crew. But it's okay. I mean, we had a very successful race. And they were very nice to me.
There you go. Now, I promised to give you one more quote from Eleanor. And this is basically food for thought. It comes from the same opinion that I started with tonight. And it actually ends the opinion. And when we were discussing this, how to use it in something that we've been working on, we both agreed that it is so powerful that just like with some types of music, I don't know, pick Beethoven's 9th, Beethoven's 5th, 9th Schubert Symphony, that you need silence. So we left it as it is, and as you left it in the opinion. And I should add that this is one of the last Eleanor's opinions before she was evicted from the court because of Brexit. And this is what I would like to end with, and of course we will have questions from you. A group of men are traveling together in a boat. Suddenly one of them takes out an auger and starts to bore a hole in the hull beneath himself. His companions remonstrate with him. "Why are you doing that?" they cry. "What are you complaining about?" says he. "Am I not drilling the hole under my own seat?" "Yes," they reply, "but the water will come and flood the boat for all of us." time for questions. The only request that we have, because we're recording it, is if you want to ask a question, if you can come to the microphone, please. Go ahead.
Good evening, Dame Sharpston. Thank you very much for this delightful narration and presentation of your life and some memoirs of your life. I would like to ask if there was a point in your career as an advocate general that you thought of transitioning, of moving to become a judge in the court, and whether there was or not a moment, why? Thank you very much.
What a nice question. Thank you for that. There was a moment in the sense that in 2012, the then British judge at the court, Sir Conrad Sheeman, retired. And so the United Kingdom advertised the post of judge, you know, information pack and so on. And I wondered about it, and I got hold of the information pack. And I thought, well, you know, the only way I'm going to know whether I really want to put in for this is if I start, often if you're a lawyer, it helps to start the drafting, right? So if I try to draft what would go into the lettre de motivation, you know, then I will see whether I have convinced myself that I want to do that. And of course, I had had the experience of working for Sir Gordon Slynn and seeing that his character suited being an advocate general but didn't suit being a judge. And in many, or at least not a judge in that tradition, and in many ways Sir Gordon and I were uncomfortably alike. But never mind, you know, I got my electronic document open on the computer and I started writing. And I wrote for about half an hour, and then I sat back and I pressed print and went to the printer and, okay, what have I said? And then I laughed. Because what I had written was, I should begin by saying that I find my present job of Advocate General immensely fulfilling and interesting, and I enjoy doing it very much. And I thought, well, if that's what you're saying about the job you're currently doing, maybe you should take the hint, and maybe you should stay as the Advocate General.
Yes, Sarisia, can you come over to the microphone? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Risa. I am from Ukraine, and as I know that you are a very good friend of Ukraine, thank you for this position and for your support. My question is that, as I understand, you had not easy way to be yourself and to have these positions that you had. And you are strong as a person and as a woman. And now we live in a turbulent time. There are a lot of different sexist expressions. For example, a couple of days ago, we had this comment from Elon Musk in social media to Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada, that you are a girl, etc. And like every day, it's very hard to live if you are a woman and to fight for our rights. And my question is, because a real happiness for women maybe starts from the moment when you feel yourself enough. And my question is, what is your motivation, what is your inspiration and recommendation to feel ourselves enough?
Thank you for that. I think my starting point has to be that I was very blessed in my parents and my family, because they never created in me any feeling that because I happened to be female rather than male, that I was less worthy, less intelligent, less dynamic, less able to do whatever. So that was the first thing, and it was extraordinarily important, because part of it is believing in yourself. You don't have to be, by the way, arrogant. You just have to assume that you should be able, if you want to do it and you apply yourself to it with whatever it is, with intelligence and courage, that you should be able to get this to happen. And that was true of being a barrister. But I mean, being a barrister is partly that anyway. If you stand up as a barrister on behalf of someone in court, you are representing them and making the argument that if they had your training and your knowledge and your expertise, that they would make for themselves. And you have to be prepared to do that, and you have to be fearless. And so, in a sense, it's sort of wrapped in with having chosen that as a career. You can't be a barrister and sort of stand up and apologize for standing up and say, well, I'm here on behalf of this person, but I'm only going to mumble at you and then I'm going to sit down. I mean, you're not doing your job. Your job is to get up there and put the case for them. And I think the other half of what I'd say is you can only do any job as yourself. When I started my training as a pupil barrister, remember, I'm really not very conventional English barrister. They don't grow them like me, right? When I started my training as a pupil barrister, various people told me how a pupil is meant to behave. You know, you're meant to be like this, you're meant to be like that. You're meant to make the tea for your pupil master. You're meant to help them do the Times crossword. You're never meant to venture an opinion. You're always, you know. And I went into chambers, and for about 6 hours, not a full day, for about 6 hours, I saw whether I could do this. Now, one of the things I do is I do some theatre. And so for a play, all right, I can be somebody else. But that is for the duration of the play. Whether I'm Kvashnir, a seller of dumplings in Gorky's lower depths, or whether I'm one, I mean, it doesn't matter what the part is, I can play the part. And then when we get to the end of the play, I step out of the part and I'm myself. You cannot have a professional career playing a part for 20, 30, 40 years. You have to put into your career the person who you are, and you have to be able to believe that you, being the person you are, you have got something you can bring to that career, to bring to that job, which is unique because it's you. There's nobody else just like you, it's you. And which is going to be a valid and valuable way of doing that job. And if you can do it like that, you will make it.
I think we have time for one more question. If you can just go, two. Okay, 2 questions. Ladies first.
Well done.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your talk. This was very inspiring for me because I'm actually a lawyer, language enthusiast, and a violinist myself. So this was fantastic for me. And I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned that you love language learning, how have your languages helped you in your legal career as well? Because this is something I'm thinking about as well in my position a lot. Yeah.
Excellent question. Thank you. For EU law, language has been enormously helpful and important to me because, I mean, EU law is itself an extraordinary challenge because you have legislation which is written and equally valid in all the languages. And it's happened to me fairly often when I was writing an opinion that I would look at the different language texts. And when you did that, inevitably you would realize that you could not do what you would do in an English court. I have once spent an entire morning in an English court arguing about a comma. Where a comma was, and the fact that it was there was very significant, because if it had been there rather than there, the whole sentence would have changed its meaning, right? You cannot do that with an EU law text, because your chances of finding a comma in the same place, right, in Article 27, you will not. So, first of all, for looking at the text, for understanding why you have to take a teleological approach, because it's the only approach that works. But I'm going to say it means much more than that. It means much more because it enables you to look at EU law through different sets of eyes. If you look at EU law through the text of a German article in a German law journal, or a French article, or an Italian article, or a Spanish article, they won't look the same, because everyone is it's the peculiar genius of EU law, that it somehow pulls itself together from all these different legal traditions. So the more you can look at it through different traditions, the more you will see the possibilities for disagreement, but also the possibilities for synthesis. And, I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but I will add just a third point to this. Of course, language gives you that opportunity of making contact with a colleague in a completely different way from the relations if you insist that they have to speak your language. I'm very conscious of this as a native English speaker, because there is such an arrogance to the British. You know, I mean, we gave the world English, you guys should speak English. Yeah. Actually, that puts a complete shape on any discussion. If I am in my native language and you are French and I'm insisting you should speak to me in English, I mean, how rude, okay? Because at the court I worked, the working language of the court is French, by the way, it's not English. So a lot of my work at the court was in French. I am, in my own terms, I will never be bilingual. I will still occasionally make mistakes. But I can argue anything you like in French, and I can dream in French. And I've got other languages which are not at that level, but which are still enable me to have a civilized conversation with a colleague, and enable me to pay them the courtesy of respecting them and their language and their legal tradition and their legal culture. And that is a much better way of working together, of collaborating, and particularly in the context of EU law. There used to be a rather two-edged joke in Brussels. The question was, who are the Europeans who have English as their mother tongue? And the answer was the Irish. And if you think about that, I mean, it's funny, but it's got a real undercurrent to it. Because the difference between the British and the Irish was that the British would turn up to a meeting and insist that everyone spoke English, whereas the Irish would turn up to a meeting, and if it made sense to have part of the discussion in French, surely wouldn't be having trouble with it at all.
Right, the final question for tonight, please. By the way, this is something that Eleanor will be talking about tomorrow during the lecture.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Hearing somebody relate their life history and their professional experience with so much wit is very entertaining, but also very inspiring for sure, and easy to take away. Elements of your story home as well. And also hearing somebody successful acknowledge the role of luck is very refreshing, I think, as well. So thank you so much for that. My name is Casper, I'm from the Netherlands. In one of the other interviews in the videos on YouTube that I saw, you were talking about cases that have kind of haunted you a little bit, and you mentioned the Metric Martyr case in particular. And you mentioned that it kind of foreshadowed this Euroscepticism as well. I was wondering, could you elaborate a little bit on this, and could you maybe mention some other cases that have either haunted you or that have foreshadowed this Euroscepticism that you saw there as well? Thank you.
Thank you. I will say something about metric martyr. I will also mention one other case, which is European Convention of Human Rights rather than an EU law, but it's a case that haunts me. Let's begin with metric martyr. Metric martyr was, in its sense, in its way, a kind of really stupid case ever to have happened, because it was about selling a bunch of bananas. Okay? The sale took place at a market, at a street market, in the north of the England, in Sunderland. The man who sold the bananas was called Mr. Steve Thoburn, and he had had a discussion with the local Weights and Measures Authority a few weeks before. They had done an inspection and they had found that the scales on which he weighed his fruit and vegetables to sell them to the customers, those scales would only weigh in imperial measure in pounds and ounces. They were not physically capable of weighing also in grams and kilograms. And so the inspectors had scratched out the mark on the scales saying these are authorized for sale, to be used for sales. And they'd said to him, Steve, you really have to get yourself a set of scales that weigh in both. I mean, if they weigh in both, we don't mind what you say to the clients, but the sales have to be on a set of scales that weigh also in metric. And he said, oh, I'm about to go on holiday, but I'll get it fixed when I get back. Well, he came back from holiday, and those nice people from the UK Independence Party came and talked to him. And they said, Steve, this is your moment to strike a blow for freedom. You don't have to put up with this horrible Brussels legislation, because there is a 1986, from memory, Weights and Measures Consolidation Act, and the Consolidation Act was passed by Parliament after the European Communities Act, 1972. Parliament is sovereign. Parliament is sovereign, and if Parliament passed that act, as it did in 1986, that takes precedence over the European Communities Act, 1972. Go on using your scales. Strike a blow for freedom. So when the inspectors came back, he told them in fairly colourful language to get lost. And the city of Sunderland was in a bit of a difficulty, because on the one hand, they didn't actually really want to prosecute him, but on the other hand, UKIP and there was a thing called the British Weights and Measures Party. I mean, there was a association also behind this. They wrote to all the local authorities to say, either one of you prosecute somebody and we can get this decided by the court, or if none of you have the courage to do that, we will bring proceedings for judicial review and say you are failing to enforce the law. And by the way, it would have been much more difficult and awkward to have tried to defend proceedings for judicial review. You can imagine standing up there on behalf of the local authority. Well, Miss Sharpston, why aren't your clients enforcing the law? Well, my lord, of course they believe the law is valid, my lord. Yes, why aren't they enforcing it, Miss Sharpston? Not a good place to be. And so the city of Sunderland sighed, and then they prosecuted Mr. Thoburn. So he is being prosecuted for a criminal offence. I don't think it was ever made clear to him that he was almost certainly going to get convicted. By the way, this is not a conviction where he was sent to prison. The scales were confiscated. He was fined, I think, £750. I mean, you know, it was, as these things go, it was a small conviction, but of course, it was a criminal conviction. This is a 5-day case in the Magistrates' Court in Sunderland with, as counsel for Mr. Thoburn, a barrister who believed fervently in everything that UKIP was saying. The poor magistrate, we had a professional magistrate, a stipendiary magistrate. He was shown so much stuff you wouldn't believe. He was shown a case about the Duke of Norfolk's cook. He was shown, no, really. He was shown authorities about the quality. I mean, oh God. It's the only case in my life that I have prosecuted. I have done defence work sometimes. I haven't done that much criminal work in one way or the other. It's the only case I ever prosecuted. I prosecuted wearing velvet gloves, all right? Because the whole thing was deeply, deeply political. There were demonstrations outside the court. There were people throwing things. I received sackfuls of hate mail. I mean, with very crude sexual offensive remarks. I mean, I received a lot.
Perhaps we should clarify that you had no choice because you were instructed
This is
by
the
a
point.
solicitor.
This is the point. As a member of the bar, I had written an opinion sometime earlier about this legislation. Under the code of conduct of the bar, I could not turn down these instructions. I was free. It was for a proper professional fee. It was in an area of law that I practiced. We have something called the cab rank rule, the taxi cab rule. You know, like the taxi with its light on saying I'm free. This barrister had her light on saying she was free, right? So I had to accept the instructions. By the way, I would have been delighted to accept the instructions on the other side of the case. It would have been fine. I would have run the argument that this particular provision in the EU directive saying that loose goods sold from bulk, had to be sold in metric was probably a violation of proportionality and subsidiarity and didn't respect the legal base, and I would have asked for a reference for a preliminary ruling to the court. Because the legislation was all legislation about free movement of goods. These goods were not crossing any new frontier, right? They had already come into the UK. They were not pre-labelled, pre-packaged, so there were no repackaging costs or any of that stuff, Walter Rao and others. This was simply somebody being tidy and saying, well, I think we should complete the process of metrification. And if I had had the defence brief, I would have accepted it with pleasure. I would have asked for a reference. The national judge, I am sure, would have given me a reference because this was a really, really hot potato. I mean, this was not a case you wanted to decide. And I would probably have won it in Luxembourg. But it could not be won on the basis of saying that English national law was somehow superior to EU law. I mean, you couldn't do it like that. But that case does hurt me because Steve Thoburn, he was actually a really nice man. He was not a very intelligent man. I mean, he was not, as one says, the sharpest knife in the knife block, okay? But he was a nice man and he knew his job of selling fruit and veg and he sold good quality stuff and he was being manipulated by UKIP and the British Weights and Measures Association. He lost the case. They kind of twisted his arm right the way behind his back and insisted that he appealed. His wife didn't want him to appeal, but they said, come on, Steve, you've got to fight. You know, you're already famous up and down the country as the metric martyr. You have to fight. And the case went to the divisional court, and they lost there. by the way, the poor city of Sunderland, they were spending all their legal budget for the year on this wretched case, right, which they never wanted. He tried to take it to the House of Lords. The House of Lords said, we're not touching it. He then lodged an application in Strasbourg, and then he dropped dead of a heart attack because the stress of all of this was just too much. And I felt really bad about that. I mean, you know, I had just done my job, and he had never suggested to me that I'd done anything except doing my job. We were, you know, we would meet in the buying a cup of tea at the court, and, you know, we were perfectly civil to each other. But he was just being manipulated, and it was so unfair. It really was. The other case I'm going to mention, to leave you just with this little trailing thought that sometimes the practice in law does unexpected things. I acted on behalf of a group of homosexual sadomasochists. No, really. I became involved in the case is called the Crown against Brown, Jaggard and Lasky. And I became involved because a senior lawyer bought me a drink at a training weekend for young lawyers, which I was attending as one of the trainers by that stage, but I wasn't very old or experienced. And Anna Worrell QC bought me a drink, and she said, I'd like to pick your brains, let me buy you a beer. This is traditional. And then she told me about the case. It had all the acts in question, and some of them seemed fairly violent, but they had all been done with consent. I mean, this was about sexual stimulation and gratification. Everyone has their own idea of what's fun in sex and what isn't fun, right? But this was unquestionably all about sex. It wasn't actually all about violence. And they had been prosecuted for occasioning actual bodily harm, ABH. They had been prosecuted under an 1861 statute, which is normally used if there is a fight outside a public house after closing time, all right? Where obviously it's, you know, it's aggressive and hostile and all of that. There was no hostility in this at all. It was giving pleasure. And as my client, Colin Lasky, memorably said, he was a Welsh rugby referee, and he had a lovely lilting Welsh voice. And she said, and you know, Eleanor, when we'd finished, we made a nice cup of tea. Unfortunately, there was video evidence. They'd done a bit of home filming, you know, like people take photos of their kids playing in the paddling pool, right? There was some video evidence of this, which was not for proselytizing, it was for the group. But there was video evidence, and they kind of put the rope round their own neck. Because when the police had interviewed them, they had very freely cooperated. And they had identified, you know, yes, that's myself, and that one in the kilt is Jock, and that one is Colin, and, you know, and this is where they live, and so on. The fatal mistake was they thought that because there was consent, that no offence had been committed. The law was very uncertain. There wasn't case law yet about homosexual sadomasochists. And so, you know, all the evidence was there of what had happened. The only point was, the point of law, is consent a valid defence or is it not? They were convinced they were sent to prison. Anna Worrell, QC, was doing the appeal. This was at the moment when she asked me, could there be a European point in it? And I gulped a bit when I was told what had been happening, and I said, well, it's not really European Union law. You'll probably agree with my analysis of that on the facts. But I think there's a very big point under the ECHR, because there is your sexual personality as part of the right to privacy under Article 8. And there was also a point under Article 7, because was it in fact foreseeable that there is sexual offences legislation in the UK, but this was not under the sexual offences legislation. This was under the law of assault. Was it reasonably foreseeable that you would be prosecuted under the law of assault for sex? So, I did a bit of work for Anna, and she ran the case in the Court of Appeal, where it sank like a piece of lead to the bottom of the sea. And then they appealed to the House of Lords. And 1 week before it opened in the House of Lords, they realised that they had put into the petition an argument under the ECHR, but they knew nothing about it. So there were 8 barristers involved, 4 QCs, 4 juniors. We had a meeting so that they could ask me about the ECHR, and I explained. And then they said, we need you on the team. They then wrote an opinion which was wonderful in the degree of ignorance that it displayed about European law, because they referenced the fact that I'd just spent 3 years at the court, the Luxembourg court, and therefore I knew all about the case law of the Strasbourg court. And so legal aid was extended, and I came in, and I thought I would be supplying the material for one of the QCs to plead it, and they said, oh, no, you're doing this one. And I went, oh, okay then. Ladies and gentlemen, this was my 10th time ever on my feet as a barrister. I had done work with other people. I had sat there when they had stood up and pleaded the case. But in terms of actually standing up and pleading myself, this was literally the 10th time on my feet. And I am in the Supreme Court, I'm in the House of Lords, and I am trying to persuade them that this rather interesting form of sex is absolutely fine and it's not a criminal offence.
And on the bench you have
On
Sir
the
Gordon
bench,
Slynn.
On the bench I have Sir Gordon Slynn, who's now back there. I also have Lord Mustill, who's a fine man, but that's just 2 out of the 5. The other, Laurie and Jauncey, and above all Lord Templeman in the chair, are not people who think that sadomasochism should be encouraged. And I have a very clear memory of Lord Templeman as the chairman, and he was so disgusting that he was kind of foaming at the mouth. And he said, Miss Sharpston, you're surely not suggesting to us that these vile and disgusting acts, I say again, these vile and disgusting acts, have anything to do with love. And I remember kind of straightening my shoulders and pulling my gown around my shoulders, and then looking him in the eye and saying, my lord, that is precisely my submission. I convinced Sir Gordon and Lord Mustill. I did not convince the other 3. The Lords upheld the conviction. The case went on to Strasbourg. The commission referred it on to the court. The court was a very conservative with a small c and Catholic with a big C court. And, the Roman Catholic Church is not very keen on sadomasochism as a sexual practice. So we lost in Strasbourg. You hear me talking about a case that I pleaded in 1991. I still feel it was an injustice. I still feel that this was private sexual conduct between consenting adults who were respectful of each other and of what gave gratification. and they were not proselytizing, they weren't recruiting, they were not causing any permanent harm. Ironically, there was another case called the Crown and Donovan shortly afterwards, which involved a happily married heterosexual couple, and the lady had asked her husband to leave some permanent mark of his affection on her body, and he put his initials, he branded them onto her backside with a butter knife. And the trial judge in that case felt that he was bound by the decision of the House of Lords in Brown, so he convicted, he gave a conditional discharge. He said he thought this was a terrible waste of police time because there was somebody reported, there was a peeping Tom, somebody reported it. Mr. Brown and Wilson, sorry, the Crown and Wilson, not Donovan, Donovan's an earlier case, the Crown and Wilson. Mr. Wilson, Andy Wilson, Mr. Wilson appealed, and the Court of Criminal Appeal allowed the appeal and said that this was, of course, completely different from Brown. Now, if I had given you two statements describing the facts, there was a branding in Brown, there was a branding in Wilson. If I had put Tipp-Ex over the names, so you did not have the names to guide you, and I had said to you, which is Brown, which is Wilson, you would have got it wrong. Because the branding in Wilson was designed to last, whereas the branding in Brown was not. So basically, this was a happily married heterosexual couple. Naturally, they weren't doing anything we would disapprove of. Homosexual group of men, they were all in perfectly respectable, reasonable jobs, honest citizens getting on with their lives, and all their lives were completely destroyed. They were sent to prison. That was, you know, the end of so many things. It was an injustice. I felt it was an injustice in 1991. I feel it's an injustice in 2025.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, for the whole evening. We see each other hopefully tomorrow for the lecture. We're going to hear more about the Court of Justice and how it is to work at the court and how it is to be an advocate general. Thank you very much, Eleanor. Thank you.